BAE Systems, the British company, is certainly one of the most, if not the most immoral company on the planet. There was certainly a period from the late 80s through the 90s when it was undoubtedly involved in more corrupt activity than any other commercial enterprise on the planet. And the British government chose to turn a blind eye to that behavior. But in addition to which, BAE Systems single-handedly contributes to extraordinary immiseration and suffering around the world. To give just one example, in the last couple of years, BAE has sold Saudi Arabia hundreds of millions of pounds worth of bombs and missiles. Those bombs and missiles have been rained down by a Saudi-led coalition on innocent civilians in Yemen. Anywhere between 4,000 and 12,000 innocent civilians have been killed, probably many of them by British bombs and missiles. In addition to which, British advisors are supposedly advising the Saudi-led coalition on its targeting, which a UN report identifies as having targeted in at least 1/3 of its attacks civilian targets. It has corrupted countries around the world, including my own country, South Africa, where just 4 years into our democracy, BAE paid £115 million of bribes, according to the Met Police, in order to win a contract for which its product should never have been awarded the contract. It was only because the defense minister who was bribed ensured that BAE won the contract. What that did is it undermined South Africa's young democracy. It ensured that scarce resources were spent on weapons that the country didn't need and has barely used, rather than, for instance, providing life-saving medication for millions of South Africans living with HIV or AIDS at the time. In fact, Harvard University has estimated that as a consequence of that policy decision, at least 365,000 South Africans died avoidable deaths within 5 years of that decision. This is the sort of effect that BAE Systems has on the world, but it also has a corroding impact on Britain's own democracy and on the rule of law in this country. I say that because so much of what BAE Systems does is kept out of the public sphere by the veil of national security imposed secrecy that overhangs all of the arms deals that they do and all of their activities, be they legal or illegal. It means that when a brave prosecutor is prepared to try and bring them to trial, the government will step in and ensure that that doesn't happen. The nature of the relationships between the company and between politicians, very senior politicians, between the company and military leaders, between the company and intelligence agents, is such that I believe together they operate in a way that benefits the company, that benefits other individuals, both politically and economically, and that is to the disadvantage of the best interests of the United Kingdom. Our senior politicians in the UK are the salespeople in chief for the UK's arms industry. And they serve that industry completely uncritically. So they don't mind how much corruption is involved in the arms deals, remembering that the arms trade accounts for 40% of all corruption in global trade. And secondly, they don't mind who those weapons are sold to. So they're quite happy with companies like BAE and others selling weaponry to Saudi Arabia, for instance, which is using that weaponry to kill innocent civilians in Yemen at the moment. The British government justifies the British arms industry by suggesting that it sells to democratic governments who support Britain's vision of the world. In addition to which, the British government claims that it is creating jobs, that it is creating economic growth, and that the industry is important in maintaining Britain's place in the world. The reality is very different to that. Britain sells weapons to anyone who will buy them. Britain sells weapons to numerous authoritarian, dictatorial regimes who use those weapons to oppress their own people, who use those weapons to violate international humanitarian law, and even to commit war crimes. In addition to which, the sale of weapons from British companies invariably involves huge levels of corruption. So not only is Britain violating a range of international laws, of multilateral agreements, but it is also violating British national law, and it is propagating corruption around the world and in Britain itself. It is worth saying that what these arms exports do is, rather than buttress Britain's position in the world or secure Britain's national security and defence, it actually undermines both. We have seen links between countries that Britain has sold weapons to over decades and atrocities committed on British soil. We have seen Britain engage in wars primarily to sell weapons that have created not only extraordinary misery in those countries, but have had huge consequences for the United Kingdom, political consequences and even consequences of violence committed on British soil. So it really is my contention that despite what the government says, what the British arms industry actually does is it undermines Britain's standing in the world, it undermines Britain's supposed support for democratic values, which its arms exports are themselves undermining, and it actually, and most ironically, makes Britain itself less rather than more safe. The biggest arms deal in history was something called the Al-Yamamah deal between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia. It was a deal worth about £43 billion, in which over £6 billion of bribes were paid, primarily to members of the Saudi royal family. This was the most corrupt commercial transaction in commercial history of all time. It was sanctioned by Margaret Thatcher, whose son Mark Thatcher was paid £12 million as a bribe on the deal. The greatest irony of all, though, is that the son of the Saudi defense minister, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who was the Saudi ambassador to the United States at the time, was paid over £1 billion into his accounts, which were held in Riggs Bank opposite the White House in Washington, D.C. Some of that money found its way into his wife's account and inadvertently, he claims, into the accounts of two of the 9/11 hijackers. It was only at that point that American authorities became at all interested in the deal. Other than that, they were quite happy with the bribes, as were the British. And it should also be borne in mind that in addition to the over £1 billion, Prince Bandar was also gifted by BAE an Airbus for his private and personal use, painted in the colours of his favourite American football team, the Dallas Cowboys. Until at least the end of 2007, the British taxpayer was paying for the running and maintenance of that birthday gift. This transaction became the subject of a massive investigation by the Serious Fraud Office, at the point at which they were ready to charge senior executives of BAE and the company itself with corruption. Tony Blair's government stepped in and closed down the investigation. That deal, more than any other, reflects the true nature of the British arms export industry. Dicey is one of the world's largest arms fairs. Most of the world's arms companies will exhibit at Dicey. Most of the world's governments, from democratic through autocratic to despotic, will be at Dicey concluding orders for weaponry. Weaponry that might be used against their own people. Weaponry that might be used against innocent civilians in other parts of the world. Weaponry that might land up being used against British citizens. Dicey reflects the true, corrupt, uncaring reality of the global arms trade brought together in a corner of London. It is a stain, as our mayor has said, on London itself and on the United Kingdom. Every year, as Dicey gets bigger, so too have the protests. And what has certainly struck me over the last 2 or 3 manifestations of this arms fair is not just the number, but the commitment and the courage of those people protesting this arms fair. There is absolutely no doubt that these protests have not only raised awareness about what dicey is, about the nature of the arms trade in which the United Kingdom plays such a large part, but I believe it has also created a greater awareness about issues of British foreign policy and how they might not be in Britain's best interests. And it is for that very reason that we have seen, particularly in the recent election discussions, we have actually seen a change in the nature of debate. And we have started to link the tragic events that happen on British soil to aspects of British foreign policy, and particularly to aspects of the British arms trade. And I think that movement in this debate is really to a large part down to the sorts of difficulties that protesters over the years have been creating at dicey and the sort of awareness that has been generated by that. So I think the protest that accompanies dicey is absolutely crucial and is something that each of those committed individuals who gets involved should be extremely proud of.